good morning. Good morning. I'm Nick Bausko. I'm from the ecology department here on campus, and I'm going to introduce Peter. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Peter Vitousek, who's coming from the Department of Biological Sciences at Stanford University. I think if you're involved in the fields of ecology or biogeochemistry or even environmental microbiology, then the name Vitousek is fairly familiar to you. It's pretty ubiquitous on a lot of publications related to nitrogen and phosphorus cycling. Peter's work within N and P cycling within tropical forests has contributed enormously to our understanding of how essential biogeochemical cycles interact and the consequences for this on ecosystem activity and productivity. Peter received his PhD from Dartmouth and then joined the faculty at Stanford in 1984, where he's currently the Clifford G. Morrison Professor in Population Resources in the School of Biological Sciences. He is also the director of the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources and the co-director of the First Nations Futures Institute. He was elected to the National Academy of Science in 1992 and the American Academy of Arts and Science in 1993. More recently, in 2010, he received the Japan Prize, which is a prize given out for original and outstanding achievements in science and technology. Just a quick note, there's a brown bag lunch for postdocs and graduate students, so if any of you are interested in meeting and talking with Peter, then between 12:30 and 1:30 in the cafeteria we'll be doing that. And then without any further ado, I invite Peter here, where he's going to talk about islands as model systems for understanding soils, ecosystems, and human-environment interaction.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I've actually never been on the Lawrence Berkeley campus before. I've been on the UC Berkeley campus many times, but it's obviously a beautiful place with a fantastic view, so I've really appreciated that today. Can't have everything. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you after the session and learning what's going on. I've already learned about some spectacular work that is going on here. I'm now involved in a number of lines of work. I want to talk about a couple of them today. The things that are most active in my lab now are I'm working to understand controls of soil and ecosystem development and climate ecosystem interactions using the Hawaiian Islands as a model system. I'm working to understand human-land interaction in the era before fossil fuels and global economies, focusing on the Pacific Islands. And I'm also involved in work in agricultural biogeochemistry in rapidly developing economies, particularly in China. I'm going to talk about just the first two here. And in both of them, I'm going to take a model systems perspective. And by saying model systems, I mean something very similar to what physiologists have long used and molecular biologists have more recently thought of in terms of model systems. And an illustration of that is the nematode C. elegans, which is widely used as a model system for development in molecular biology. Won't read through all of this, but the last sentence, I think, is the key one for the work I'll be describing here. It thus provides the researcher with an ideal compromise between complexity and tractability. And my suggestion is that the island systems that I'll be talking about here similarly provide researchers with an ideal compromise between complexity and tractability. Got to have both. If it's too simple, it's not general. If it's too complex, you can't understand it. And I think that islands have been used as model systems, or can be used as model systems, across a pretty wide spectrum of topics of potential scientific understanding. Clearly, for evolution and the origin of species, islands have been a model at least since Darwin in the Galapagos talked of, after visiting the Galapagos, that here he felt near, both in space and time, to that great fact, that mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on the earth. And of course, he felt near because he was near, because he could see the process of speciation, incipient speciation, and realized speciation in a way that continental systems are typically just too complex to pick out. Also, I think islands are really useful for understanding the formation, structure, and dynamics of soils and ecosystems. And I've been working on that in Hawaii for a long time. And Hawaii is really useful for this because we can hold some factors constant to an extent that's really difficult to match in a continental system. The islands are all basalt. They have a relatively low and defined natural diversity where one tree species, the Ohia lehua, is found often as the dominant from areas getting as little as 400 millimeters of rain a year to as much as 10 meters of rain a year, from sea level to tree line, and from the first woody plant colonizing young lava flows to the oldest high islands in Hawaii. And volcanic topography, we can hold coarse scale topography constant too, to an extent that's really difficult to match elsewhere. This is Mauna Loa volcano, where the long-term carbon dioxide record comes from, 4,200 meters tall, and you can see this topography is essentially absent from it on a coarse scale. There are also some other features that make it really useful. The basalt of the Hawaiian archipelago is derived from a mantle source, and it has isotopic signatures that are different from that of the ocean that surrounds Hawaii or the continental crust. And so we can use these differences to trace the inputs of elements to ecosystems by weathering, using the ratios of element to niobium versus the ocean. That distinction can be made with strontium isotopes very cleanly. We can also distinguish any material that comes in from continental crust using another suite of tracers, including neodymium isotopes. And finally, there are factors that vary very substantially within Hawaii, including climate and substrate age. And for example, for climate, this is the north end of the island of Hawaii. There's a rainfall gradient here that I think is the most spectacular in the world, which runs from about 4,500 millimeters of rain a year here to about 180 millimeters of rain there over a distance of 17 kilometers. So really spectacular rainfall variation while holding substrate and original vegetation constant. Also, substrate age varies on both short and long-term time scales, and this is the long-term scale. The islands result from the activity of a convective plume, a hot spot that's pushing material up through the continental crust, the oceanic crust rather, and has been doing so for tens of millions of years. And so a given active volcano, Kilauea on the island of Hawaii here, is fed by that hot spot, but as the islands slide off to the northwest, it loses contact with that rising plume, eruptive activity slows and eventually ceases, and you get progressively older islands riding off to the northwest, up to millions of years old. We've done a lot of work with a large number of scientists on this. I'll summarize some of that work very, very briefly here in terms of the sources of nutrients that support soil fertility and maintain forest productivity in the long term. And that is, we can think of the sources of elements as being rock, the breakdown of the rock of Hawaii, rain, atmospheric deposition mostly from the ocean that surrounds the Hawaiian Islands, and dust, long-distance transport of continental dust, mostly from Asia, mostly during ice ages. And not surprisingly, young soils, most of the nutrients that support plant productivity are derived from the breakdown of basaltic rock. But in wetter areas that receive 2,500 millimeters or more of rain a year, basalt is depleted of most of its nutrients in just a few 10,000 years, tens of thousands of years. And most rock-derived nutrients, except phosphorus, are after that point deposited from rain and cloud water, ultimately from marine aerosol. Phosphorus is much less mobile than calcium, magnesium, potassium, and other rock-derived nutrients, which is a good thing. But even with phosphorus, by about 1.5 million years, most of it is either gone or bound up in insoluble complexes or in the interior of soil aggregates. And the phosphorus from rock becomes largely unavailable. After that, it's dust that's blown in from Asian deserts, particularly during glacial periods, that becomes the most important source of phosphorus, that allows the persistence of forest on the oldest substrate in the archipelago. And that last process is something that's pretty interesting, and it's something we can take that understanding, which we can trace quite clearly in Hawaii using neodymium isotopes and other sorts of tracers, and apply in other rainforest areas of the world. And it's a general feature that on stable topographic surfaces, high rainfall areas, rainforests on these old substrates are supported by the long-distance transport of nutrients from semi-arid and arid areas hundreds to thousands of kilometers upwind. Another interesting feature that's more directly what I want to talk about in the first part of this talk is that we see really striking thresholds in soil properties as you move along gradients of either climate or substrate age. It's not that with gradual change in forcing as you get older or as you get wetter, soils change gradually. It's rather that for long ranges of environmental forcing, they change very little. And then they change a lot. And then they don't change very much again across a broad range of forcing. So these what we call pedogenic thresholds are a really dominant feature of what we see in the soils and nutrient cycles of Hawaiian systems. This is an illustration from work by Oliver Chadwick and John Chorover, a rainfall gradient on a substrate that's 150,000 years old, and base saturation in the blue dots and line. And you see that base saturation is very high, up to about 1,200 millimeters of rain a year, drops off a cliff, and then is very low from about 1,700 millimeters a year on out. And what drives this particular threshold is the exhaustion of rock as a source of nutrients. There's weathering, shown in the yellow here, is driven by the rainfall, especially the water moving through the profile, increases as a function of increasing rainfall till you get to the point where the primary minerals in the rock that can break down have broken down. And at that point, rock can no longer supply nutrients, also can no longer buffer atmospheric acidity or biological acidity. Weathering drops down to very low levels, and we see a step change in the properties of soils along this gradient. So that's something that I want to expand, talking about a bit here today. It's something we're expanding focus on in our research now. And in doing this, we're working not just with the soils that we collected to understand how soil properties or ecosystem properties vary as a function of environmental forcing, but we've also been drawing on soil samples we collected to understand the dynamics of Polynesian agriculture that I'll be describing later in the talk. So we've taken hundreds of soil samples and for that purpose, and we're analyzing them not just for parameters related to soil fertility like base saturation or available phosphorus, but also for properties related to pedogenesis, which I'll describe in a minute. And for all of these samples, we evaluate weathering and element mobility by looking at the dynamics of the elements of interest relative to, before I go on to that, I do want to say that The threshold I showed before is this one here, where base saturation in 150,000-year-old substrate. One of the other important features we see is that these thresholds shift to progressively drier climate points as substrates get older, from 10,000 years, 150,000, 400,000, and 4 million years. So they're thresholds in climate time space, not just climate space. And we calculate weathering and mobility of elements by looking at dynamics relative, by indexing their abundance relative to an immobile element. We use niobium as the least mobile element in Hawaiian soils. And the retention or mobility of any other element can be calculated relative to niobium from the ratio of that element to niobium in parent material relative to the ratio of that element to niobium in soil. So that corrects for changes in soil volume, both expansion and collapse of soil profiles. Okay, so looking at some of the abundant and in some cases relatively immobile elements, using the many soil samples we've collected. These are to a depth of 30 centimeters, the previous to a depth of a meter or more. Using the many soil samples we've collected to understand agricultural patterns, as well as the soils we've collected for pedogenesis, all of these on 150,000-year-old substrates. You see for aluminum here, this is the proportion of aluminum that remains from the original rock versus rainfall on this axis, that we see the threshold quite clearly. That is, once base saturation drops, once the rock is exhausted, the soils acidify and aluminum becomes mobile. And it becomes mobile with a sort of threshold pattern. Iron in this range doesn't show a threshold. That is, as aluminum is lost, iron is not lost with a threshold dynamic, but rather with a gradual loss in the more acidic soils. But if we move to a wetter situation, we see threshold dynamics for iron as well, with a different threshold. This is the aluminum to iron ratio for the 150,000-year-old substrate I showed before, and you see the big change driven by aluminum here at 150,000 years old. If you look at 400,000 years old, you see that threshold occurs in a drier position, as we'd expect from other observations. But as you get out to really wet environments, iron becomes mobile. As soon as you get into iron reduction and mobility of ferrous iron, the system changes completely. And of course, that drives the dynamics of phosphorus and of organic matter, as well as just iron in these situations. So there's a threshold also out here in wet environments where we see a substantial change in soil properties occurring, more or less, not happening for a long environmental distance and then occurring. And if we look at other elements, so this is phosphorus, it shows something entirely different. This axis is different than the axes for all the other figures. This is 100% of the phosphorus remaining here, and phosphorus gets vastly enriched in one particular environmental range. Depleted in the wet sites, a bit depleted in drier sites, but vastly enriched in the top 30 centimeters of soil in this intermediate zone. And what's going on there is that we see the legacy of biological uplift of phosphorus by plants, deep-rooted forest vegetation that occupied these sites for tens of thousands to more than 100,000 years, and which have been pumping phosphorus from the subsoil to the surface. Dry sites, we don't see that surface enrichment. Actually, we see depletion. But in the intermediate zone, we see depletion at depth and accumulation at the surface. Depletion at depth, accumulation at the surface. In the wettest zones, the power of leaching is greater than the power of biological uplift, and we see phosphorus depletion to the surface. Okay, so as we characterize this particular gradient on 150,000-year-old substrates, we see very strong evidence for a couple of thresholds. One, the mineral depletion threshold, somewhere around 1,500 millimeters. An iron reduction threshold that's probably around 3,500 millimeters. And then a third threshold that's associated with the formation of carbonate deep in soil profiles that's also associated with the zone, the bottom edge of the zone where biological uplift is important. We need to understand this transition better, but as an observable feature in the field, with a lot of correlates in terms of fundamental soil properties, we see it. I'd like to understand its dynamics a bit better, what's really causing it. And I think equally interesting to the existence of these thresholds is that, it's interesting that you have places where soils change a lot along a continuous gradient without much of an increment in forcing. It's also interesting that you have substantial areas of environmental space where they aren't changing a lot. And those areas, which I'll refer to as soil process domains, are set off by these thresholds. The three thresholds define four domains, one of surface nutrient depletion and carbonate accumulation, one of weathering and surface phosphorus enrichment, one of acidity, aluminum saturation and mobility, and one of reduction and iron mobility. And these are very different soil domains that occur along this continuous gradient. Now, this is something that we're working actively on understanding this area particularly, and trying to extend. One of the areas that we need to try to understand and apply it is, to what extent are these thresholds simply a feature of dealing with basalt, especially the sharpness of the threshold. Basalt is interesting because it tends to weather congruently, that is, it dissolves under acidity and water movement. And the clays that you get form from dissolved products of weathering. More typically, weathering is incongruent. That is, you break down the primary minerals, you mobilize some fraction of them and move them out of the system, and the residuum of those primary minerals constitutes the clays that form. And so in a situation like that, how different is the pattern of thresholds and process domains? Does it even apply at all? And we're trying to test that now, working in a rainfall sequence in New Zealand. Rainfall from over 4 meters a year to under 400 millimeters a year on the South Island of New Zealand. We went there hoping to work with substrate age as well as rainfall gradients, and discovered basically a great deal of literature to the contrary. You can't work with substrate age in a very meaningful way on the South Island of New Zealand. And that's because the whole thing is covered with loess that deposited 20,000 years ago. Fine for us. We got 20,000-year-old loess and it's great climate gradient to work with. Additionally, over the past quite a few years, with other colleagues, we've been trying to apply this thinking of soil properties and soil process domains to the development and sustainability of human societies on islands. And I think there's been good work developed primarily, initially, by Patrick Kirch from the anthropology department at UC Berkeley that looks at islands explicitly as model systems for understanding human-land interaction and the development and sustainability of human societies. This is one of my favorite quotes from Kirch. If you'll read it through, you will see that he writes a lot better than I do. But besides that, he points out that Pacific, and it gives you a chance to look at what hundreds of societies have done, sometimes in comparable environments, you have replication, sometimes in very different environments. And it's not only the range of environmental variation that people colonized in the Pacific, but the fact that many societies had common origins, and the same people colonized these very different situations, that makes them such marvelous microcosms, such wonderful natural and cultural experiments of history. The people he's referring to are the Polynesians, who colonized the Pacific from 1,000 to 3,000 years ago on explicit voyages of discovery and colonization, carrying with them tens of species of plants and several species of animals that represented the economic base of their societies, and covering an extraordinary range of the world's ocean from their homeland in the Samoa, Tonga, Fiji area to the Central Pacific, to the extremes of the Hawaiian Islands, Easter Island, and New Zealand. The apices of these points on the Polynesian Triangle are more than 6,000 kilometers apart, so it's a massive fraction of Earth's surface. But one of the things that's particularly interesting, besides the fact it's one people, one set of biota, one set of ideas as they sailed as to what constitutes a productive basis for a society. But the fact that the islands they colonized are really different from the Hawaiian archipelago, which is moderate sized and contains areas that are geologically young and quite rich in nutrients, to atolls like the Tuamotus, which are tiny specks, all coral, to Easter Island, which is 1/100th the size of Hawaii, and as I'll show, very poor in soil fertility compared to parts of Hawaii, to the subcontinental landmass of New Zealand. And, of course, the same things didn't work everywhere in terms of how you developed a productive basis for society. In fact, in the South Island of New Zealand, for at least the southern, about 2/3 of the South Island of New Zealand, none of the Polynesian crops grew. So, with an interdisciplinary group initiated by Pat Kirch here at Berkeley, and a number of other anthropologists, ecologists, soil scientists, demography, hydrology, geomorphology, agronomy, etc., we've been trying to look at these productive systems as a model for understanding human-land interactions. Initially focused on Hawaii, where we have a lot of background and information. And we're interested in agriculture in particular because, first off, when you're interested in human-land interaction, agriculture is really where the two come together in a very fundamental way. There's no way around that fact. Second, features of both the land and of the societies make them particularly amenable to study, in comparison to most places in the world. So their interaction should be more accessible as well. Also, the Polynesians generally, and the Hawaiians in particular, were amazing farmers, intensifying agriculture to a very high degree of intensification and permanence by very different pathways in the different sorts of lands they farmed. And it's been an interesting thing to me as I've understood this better, particularly in Hawaii. People have a very good sense of the history of Polynesians as great navigators, the greatest navigators of their era, taking off on these thousands of kilometer-long voyages to find specks of land and finding them on purpose. Well, not in the initial discovery, but sailing back and forth on purpose to these isolated islands. But what isn't as well appreciated is that by any global standards, they were great farmers as well, with tremendously intensive levels of agriculture, high population densities, as a consequence, highly structured societies that are more intense than what you see in most continental areas contemporaneously. The most significant contrast within Hawaii is irrigated wetland cultivation, particularly of taro, versus rain-fed dryland agriculture, which was particularly focused on sweet potato. And one of the things that interested us going in is that these systems were really unevenly distributed across the Hawaiian archipelago, with the rain-fed drylands concentrated on the youngest island of Hawaii and the youngest part of the second oldest island of Maui, and essentially absent on the older islands in the archipelago. The irrigated systems were best developed on the oldest islands. The rain-fed systems were developed basically only on the young islands in the archipelago. I later discovered, after including this figure in a publication as well as a couple of grant proposals, that it was actually drawn on a cocktail napkin at a Society of American Anthropology meeting. It shouldn't be taken too seriously. It shouldn't be put into a GIS. It's right in its general features, that is, that rain-fed was here and irrigated was here, but the details are not worth putting a lot of effort into yet. So, part of our interest is why? What underlies that pattern? What are the consequences of that pattern? To look at that, we focused on this Kohala field system on the north end of the island of Hawaii. And it's an interesting place. It's along the same rainfall gradient I showed before. It is a land division that included irrigated agriculture in the deep valleys on the northeast side. These slopes will never support irrigated agriculture. No streams, no alluvial valley bottoms, no colluvial plains. Not hard to explain why. And so this, in the windward side, the oldest part of the island of Hawaii, did support these. And these systems of irrigated taro were developed very intensively by about 1200 AD, about 600 years before European contact. They persisted through European contact and the disruptions of colonization and the introductions of European disease to maintain some social and cultural continuity up to the present. The irrigated systems, the rain-fed systems have had quite a different history. This is a picture of the remains of the rain-fed system in ranchland. They developed a very dense network of field walls running across the slope here and paved trails that in this particular system covered about 60-some kilometers squared of land with a very dense network of agricultural infrastructure. And these reached a very high level of development prior to European contact, but the European diseases and depopulation and the opportunities for urbanization and interaction with foreigners both combined to push people off this land. And the systems collapsed by about 1850. They haven't operated since. And so they're known primarily to archaeology and some Hawaiian language newspapers of the time of colonization, but they haven't actually been operated for over 150 years. But they're remarkable features. This is a LiDAR image of a portion of that field system, which gives you a sense for just how intensively this area was worked. And my sense in looking at these systems is, we're not looking at village gardens. We're not looking at backyard gardens. We're looking at the Polynesian equivalent of Iowa, taking the most productive land, altering it utterly to make it a productive agricultural system that provided a surplus, that allowed the development of a complex and highly hierarchical society. So why there, and how did it work? This figure shows the bounds of that rain-fed dryland system. It also shows two different ages of substrate, 150,000 years, 400,000 years, rainfall isohyates in red, elevation in black, and the red dots show places we've collected soil samples in trying to understand the distribution and dynamics of this agricultural system. And our expectation was that the threshold of soil fertility that I showed before would set the upper rainfall bound of the intensive rain-fed system. If you're running an intensive agricultural system, inherently you're removing nutrients from it. They have to be replaced in order for productivity to be sustained. If you're working in an area where your main source of nutrients is rain, atmospheric deposition, takes a long time to replace them. If you're in a zone where weathering of rock is important, then you have the potential to develop those intensive systems. If you can manage nitrogen, which is a piece of the story I need to know a lot more about. And indeed, we found that this is the figure showing phosphorus remaining from parent material. The yellow dots represent the points taken within the Hawaiian agricultural system. And indeed, the Hawaiian system was entirely confined within the zone of weathering and phosphorus enrichment. The upper bound was coincident with that threshold in soil fertility. Interestingly, the lower bound was also coincident with that threshold at about 750 millimeters. And the Hawaiian system occupied that domain of weathering and surface nutrient enrichment and occupied all of it. It was interesting that we then went and looked at the irrigated agricultural systems and found that they're supported by erosion. You may have a 5 million year old substrate, but if you have landslides off of rocky cliffs that provide the soil in the alluvial and colluvial areas, the soil is a lot younger than the substrate. And so erosion is rejuvenating soil fertility in these areas. And in younger in smaller valleys that don't have that large-scale erosion and rejuvenation of soils, the irrigation water itself is supplying the rock-derived nutrients. So the rain-fed systems like this were sustained because people brought the crops to the places where the rock was weathering and had that as a source of nutrient supply. The irrigated systems were developed because the irrigation water brought the products of the rocks to the crops. Okay. And further, remember that these thresholds shift in time. As you get older, you have many more tens of thousands of years of water moving through the soil profile, and the threshold shifts drier and drier to the point that in anything much older than 400,000 years, there's no land surface that's both wet enough to support intensive rain-fed agriculture and fertile enough to support intensive rain-fed agriculture. So the pattern of the rain-fed systems developed on the younger islands in the archipelago and absent in the older islands of the archipelago makes sense in these terms. What's more, it's something we can put into a GIS and try to model. And we've done that, taking our information on climate and substrate age as they are correlated with the distribution of that domain of weathering and nutrient uplift, and mapped that in red here. We've also, colleague Sam Gahn at the Nature Conservancy Hawaii did an equivalent model for where you could develop an intensive irrigated agricultural system based on stream flow and topography and the ability to get water out of a stream to water an alluvial or colluvial slope. And so this is not a map of where agriculture took place, but a map of where, by our understanding, agriculture could have taken place. And to the extent there are data that we can use to test it, it's really good. I mean, the irrigated places that should have had irrigated agriculture had irrigated agriculture. The places that should have had rain-fed systems mostly have rain-fed systems. I say mostly because there are areas that were used for intensive plantation agriculture in the 19th and 20th century, especially of sugarcane. And you get enough bulldozers over that land, and you can't tell whether they did or not. And that's particularly true of this area here. But it seems to be pretty good, and it's not based on a cocktail napkin, although it is a map of agricultural potential, not a map of where we know agriculture took place. And it reproduces that essential feature of the, what I'll call the cocktail napkin map, in that the rain-fed dryland system is overwhelmingly concentrated on the youngest islands in the archipelago. The irrigated agriculture is overwhelmingly concentrated on the older islands in the archipelago. That pattern's interesting because, Hawaii supported 4 states, 4 integrated polities, nations, in the couple of hundred years before contact, with one centered on the young island of Hawaii, one centered on this complex of islands here, one on Oahu, and one on Kauai and its satellite Niihau, which means some of these nations were based on irrigated agriculture, and one was based almost entirely on rain-fed dryland agriculture. And so the productive basis of those nations was different. And we can wave our arms a little bit more and use data from labor requirements and yields in traditional agricultural systems elsewhere in the Pacific to try to talk about what kinds of labor requirements were involved in these agricultural systems. What kinds of surpluses could you produce? I'm contrasting the youngest and the oldest island in the archipelago here, the island of Hawaii, based almost entirely on rain-fed agriculture, about 580 kilometers squared of potential intensive agricultural land, 97% of it rain-fed. Kauai, about a tenth as much intensive agricultural land, all of it irrigated. The irrigated systems are more productive, so the difference in yield is nowhere near as large as the difference in land area cultivated. And the labor requirements of the rain-fed system are substantially greater per unit of yield than the labor requirements of the irrigated system once you've built your irrigation infrastructure. And so you end up with, in this calculation, agricultural labor of essentially 20 times more, 165,000 person years of labor required in the rain-fed dryland dominated system versus a little over 8,000, and a vastly greater surplus over agricultural labor in the irrigated system. Of course, surplus means that people can play lots of roles other than farmer. Still a surplus here over agricultural labor. It was still a complex society. There were warriors, chiefs, cultural practitioners, etc. But the surplus was much more substantial in the systems based on irrigation. What's more, from our understanding of these dynamics, the rain-fed systems were more vulnerable to environmental perturbations, periodic droughts, and so forth, than the irrigated systems were. And that's interesting too, because ethnohistory shows that for the couple of centuries before European contact, when these were well-defined integrated states, there were lots of marriage alliances, disputes, and wars among the different islands. And they were instigated by people from the rain-fed island of Hawaii. That's where the dynamism, that's where the aggressiveness in the interactions primarily came from. And those dynamics continued without resolution. That is, there were wars and temporary conquests up through European contact. Shortly after European contact, the chief Kamehameha from the Kohala field system, where I'm focusing, adopted some European weapons and conquered the rest of the archipelago and unified it before globalization and ultimately colonization became important. Another interesting feature of the Hawaiian system is that, well, one thing that I think is useful thinking about in this is, interactions like that between people of infertile upland systems and settled lowland systems are by no means uniquely Polynesian. European history is full of dynamics like that. So is Asian history. But the thing that's valuable here is these were the same people. And they came on the same canoes. And they came only a few hundred years before these dynamics began to play out. And it was the interactions between humans and land that took the society on different paths, not different founding nature to the society. Another thing that's interesting is, unlike some other Polynesian islands, the productivity of and social organization in Hawaii neither receded from some peak, and Easter Island has gotten to be a tremendously contentious and difficult place to talk about, but I think it's fair to say that Easter Island, before European contact, moved from a system with a high degree of social organization and cohesion and agricultural surplus to something less than that. What less than that is something that I think is reasonably very contentious. But they receded from some peak. In some other Polynesian islands, they made an explicit transition to sustainability. That is, from exploitive use of resources that was obviously unsustainable to the people living on those islands, they made a transition to explicit regulation of population impact and developed productive systems that maintained the fertility of soils and prevented erosion from damaging reefs. Neither of those things happened in Hawaii. Hawaii was more facing challenges and innovating its way out of them, developing new agricultural technologies, new productive systems, new social organizations that found their way around the demographic crunches that other systems faced, much like we are doing. Now, I have worked briefly on Easter Island with other colleagues, and it's a really fascinating place to work. It's volcanic, like Hawaii. Its age is similar to the age of Kohala, which I've focused on. It was colonized by Polynesians, like Hawaii, probably 800 years ago. And it supported rain-fed agriculture entirely, based on sweet potato as its staple. So a similar production system. And so we're interested in applying our understanding of Polynesian agriculture from Hawaii to Easter Island or Rapa Nui and trying to understand how agriculture relates to these process domains we've identified as connecting to agriculture in Hawaii. And what we find is that Rapa Nui is, in fact, overall much less fertile than Hawaii, and that's because, in part, the soils are similarly old to Kohala, but the rainfall's higher. And so they're farther along that transition to acidification and aluminum mobility over much more of the island. The main exception is places where for topographic regions, nutrient supply is enriched. And that can be on an extraordinarily small scale. This shows a plain on Rapa Nui with rock outcrops and zones of fine soil between, which is a very typical feature of volcanic topography. And in these, you have places where rocks have come down off of these rock outcrops in little mini katinas, and the foot slopes are receiving unweathered rock and are richer than the area between them that aren't influenced by these rock outcrops. What's more, the Rapa Nui people, something I've never seen in Hawaii, chip rocks off of these outcrops and spread them around the base of the outcrops. And if you look at soil fertility, and this is, I'm sorry, a transect from the rock outcrop I'm standing on here over to that rock outcrop, what you see is a really distinct pattern of enrichment in soil nutrients in that microtopographic zone at the base of the outcrops, where you have peaks in here exchangeable calcium, which after all of our work in Hawaii, I went back and looked at, and it's the best predictor of that upper wetter edge of Hawaiian agriculture. So this is where they farmed. This is where you find the soil churning and residue of intensive agriculture in these rock gardens that they developed. A couple of interesting things about them, though. This is the threshold in Hawaii. Hawaiians basically didn't farm anything below this, and anything within this was marginal. And the exchangeable calcium values in Hawaii where they did farm go up to 25 or 30 on this scale. So Rapa Nui is marginal. The second thing is they did practice intensive agriculture on these relatively marginal areas, but what they did was intensify agriculture in sweet spots of soil fertility that occur on the scale of tens of meters. In contrast, Hawaiians intensified agriculture on a scale of tens of kilometers squared. And spectacular difference in the opportunity for and the practice of intensive agriculture in those two situations. And so clearly, tremendously innovative agronomists, as most Polynesians were, at one time produced a surplus above agricultural labor, but the productive potential just wasn't there on a big scale. Now, overall, I think we've made some reasonable progress towards understanding distribution of pre-contact agriculture in Hawaii and its interactions with ecosystems and societies. We're just getting started in the other islands of Polynesia, and we're continuing to collaborate with archaeologists, anthropologists on other Polynesian islands, looking at the dynamics of human-land interaction in those places. But ultimately, I think the effort is interesting because islands in this pre-contact area, the Polynesian islands, were worlds where people lived not entirely in isolation, but more in isolation than they ever are in continental situations. In Hawaii, we know there was two-way voyaging between Hawaii and the rest of the Pacific. We also know it died out about 400 years before European contact. The last 400 years, no canoes came and went from Hawaii. So they were really isolated there. No fossil fuels, no animals that could be used as labor substitutes, no fertilizer, no container ships, and they supported populations. If you notice the labor requirements of rain-fed agriculture, supported populations that, for the Hawaiian archipelago at least, probably were greater than the populations now that live there now on any of the islands but Oahu, where the city of Honolulu is located. For all of the other islands in the archipelago, there were probably more people there in 1775 before contact than there are now. Entirely supported by local resources. So they could and did intensify production. They could and did fall into political conflict and resources. They could and did innovate their way out of demographic challenges. And also, they could see, especially on some of the smaller islands in Polynesia, how they'd changed their worlds. And they could see that what was left out there was all there was. Sometimes they responded really positively from the perspective of sustainability and developed what I think are probably the clearest examples of design for sustainability we've had in the world. Sometimes they failed to do so. The interesting thing for us now is, of course, we can see for the first time the whole system. We can see to a real extent what's left. And it's a really good question. How will we respond? Thank you. Be happy to answer any questions.
We have time for several questions. Because we're recording this, there's a microphone that's going to come out. So if you want to wait a couple of seconds for the mic.
Yeah. Please do turn that off so I can see who's actually out there. Well, there's still people there. That's good. You never know when you're in the spotlight like that. Yeah, Wendy.
That's super interesting, Peter. And I have a couple of questions. But the first one is, you present nutrient data as a proportion of remaining from parent material, which is
Right.
just something I'm not used to seeing. Did you use the same parent material number in all of those, or was it different for site? Okay.
I use two different numbers. There's the early phase of volcanism produces tholeiitic basalt that has a characteristic set of parent material ratios. Later stage alkalic basalt, which involves slower ascent and some opportunity for recrystallization in magma chambers, has a different suite of parent materials, and I use those two.
And so if you look at those patterns, or the same data set, and just look at soil nutrient concentrations or content, how do those patterns change?
The ones that are from the tholeiitic basalt as a volcano is arising are generally lower in phosphorus, not different in cations than the ones where you parent material correct.
Do you still see those thresholds, though?
Oh, thresholds. The thresholds are all done on a single age of parent material, which all has the same ratio. So across the 150,000-year-old, it doesn't make any difference. If you compare 150,000 and 400,000 on the island of Hawaii, then the 400,000-year-old, if you don't correct for parent material, falls lower. The 400,000-year-old I used there was from the island of Maui because it gets a lot wetter there. And that's the alkalic basalt also, and has the same parent material ratio as the 150,000.
Hi, Jeff Chambers, Lawrence Berkeley Lab. So I'm curious if you're familiar with these productivity gradients in the Amazon, moving from kind of eastern central Amazon to the western Amazon. And so the western Amazon forests are much more productive and dynamic and I'm curious what we might learn from these model systems and soil fertility issues with respect to understanding those gradients in the Amazon.
Yeah. When I teach a tropical ecology class, I often show a picture, just a picture, of a central Amazonian forest and a western Amazonian forest, and 20,000-year-old forest in Hawaii and a 5-million-year-old forest on a 5-million-year-old soil in Hawaii. And they look the same. And the contrast is right on between the two. And the difference is in the western Amazon, you've got material coming down off the Andes, and you have a weathering contribution. to the dynamics of forest growth in that situation. The central Amazon is actually much older than 5 million years old, and the thing that's keeping it going is Saharan dust coming in. But the difference in the quantity and quality of light coming through the forest is very, very similar in that contrast. And although I can't show it in the slide, the way the forest smells also has the same difference. And those of you who've worked in rich and poor tropical forests know what I'm talking about. You know, if you're in a rich tropical forest, what you smell is rot. You know, and there is so much life around you, and the sounds are different, and everything's different. And the nutrient-poor forest is typically quieter, and the smell is much more pungent. You're smelling terpenes, not rot. And same in Hawaii, same in eastern or central versus western Amazonia. Yeah.
How about the mosquito bite intensity factor?
You know that gradient
Oh,
too.
absolutely.
Now the reason that Hawaii is a paradise is that there were no mosquitoes until the evil Europeans brought them in the 1820s, and there are still, I put that in quotes, no mosquitoes at 1,200 meters elevation where most of my work is done. They're in the lowlands. Mosquito bite intensity is nasty in the lowlands, but not at 1,200 meters. Yeah.
So, in Hawaii, when faced with demographic challenges, they innovated.
Yeah.
Okay. Yet within the Polynesian domain, you say there are examples of societies that chose to, that didn't respond and died out, and other societies that chose for sustainability.
Right.
And presumably Hawaii would have eventually had to have made that choice had...
As we do, right?
So what are the characteristics of the societies that were able to opt for sustainability versus those that did not have the capacity? I mean, is there a moral to this story from which we can learn, other than we have to opt for sustainability?
Well, I think this is something that Pat Kirch has worked on very, very effectively. And I think his answer would be, look to the characteristics of the land, as well as the society. When you're looking in Hawaii, you're looking at a large, by Polynesian standards, productive landmass that could support a state in modern terms. And so you had essentially a society that you could recognize as a nation by how we think of nations. And that was a system that was organized for production and had some central direction and control, as well as the ability to try different things in agricultural practice. If you go to the sort of mid-sized society, then you don't have that level of organization. It's more of a chiefdom and maybe collection of villages. The places where the clearest place where that choice of a more sustainable approach was made is a population of around 1,200 people. And that's small enough that it's one group of people, and they can get together, and the chief can talk to all of them. And so if you step up in size to maybe 15,000 people, that doesn't apply anymore. And if your village makes a transition towards a more sustainable production system, which involves breadfruit and other sorts of tree crops, you're just announcing your vulnerability to everybody around you, right? There isn't any overarching control on the island. There isn't a state that controls people, and as a part of that society, it's very difficult to make innovative steps because they make you vulnerable to everybody else. If you're the only society, you're the only society you can do that because isolation gives it to you. If you're a bigger society, the state is in a position to influence what everybody does. Yeah. So which is what California should be, right? This Kirch's answer is not my answer, but I think it's a good answer too. I think the there clearly are other elements at play, and it would be really cool if you could ever know where the innovation and dynamism came from in those various kinds of societies. One of the things that I find really interesting, we're doing some work to restore sweet potato production to that area, fencing off gardens within the pasture and growing sweet potato with traditional methods and involving the community and students in that effort. And you get students in there and ask, their teachers or we will ask them, okay, so how could this be maintained? And the answer you'll get is typically that the Kapu system, the system of behavior control, was ferocious, that it could be sustained because any deviation was potentially punishable by death. And so that degree of social control was so intense that you could sustain the system. And, I think that's nonsense. In that, it's a really fascinating, original, unique sort of system with a huge amount of infrastructure that you don't see in most continental areas contemporaneously. There was a lot of creativity. There was a lot of innovation. If you're scared to do anything new because of a system of rules where deviation is punished by death, you don't innovate. So we're missing something significant in the social organization. And when the students hear that, it's really fun to see them sort of go, "Oh, that has to be true, right? So what?" And you turn it around. So yeah, so what? I don't know the answer, but there's something there.
Related to that, I'm curious just how island size plays into the sustainability of the society, as well as just some of the principles of island biogeography, like exchange with the main Polynesian society, rate of immigration, that sort of thing, how that affected innovation.
It's a really good set of questions, and Pat, again, has written substantially on size, but it would be fascinating to try to understand connectivity as well, because it's clear the apices of the Polynesian Triangle, which is where I've worked primarily, were more isolated from ongoing contact with other Polynesian societies than the central Polynesian areas were, where two-way voyaging continued up through European contact. Two-way voyaging is, of course, rejuvenated now by Polynesian navigators with Polynesian technologies, which is a fantastic and beautiful thing. But it continued in central Polynesia. It didn't continue to the apices of the Polynesian Triangle. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, 'cause they're
I'm interested in, you've done so much work on this, on these islands, these model islands. Pat and others have as well. What do you think are the richest frontiers of, big ideas to be still discovered, or have you figured it all out?
No, far from it.
Yeah.
One of the things that there are a couple of things that I think are really interesting. One is that I think that the knowledge of the societies themselves hasn't been incorporated nearly as well as it could be. The process is beginning, but in Hawaii in particular, which I know best by far, there were enormous numbers and hundreds of thousands of pages of Hawaiian language newspapers published in the 1825 to 1855 era, and it was a time when people were dying from European diseases at a very high rate, and I've read some of the material in translation. I don't read Hawaiian, but it's clear that people were writing to set down their lives before their people disappeared. Now, the people didn't disappear, but everyone thought the people were disappearing, and so there was a lot of, just this is what we do. That information is now all digitized and is becoming searchable. And those who are capable of reading Hawaiian and also are capable of understanding what people are saying when they're talking about agriculture, which is a challenge. The scholars in the School for Hawaiian Studies at the University of Hawaii Manoa may not be able to do that. But if you've worked in agriculture and you can read Hawaiian and you can search those databases, I suspect we're going to get a lot of information about how society was organized under contrasting production systems, under contrasting drought versus abundance times, and that human-land interaction will be a really rich and powerful frontier. And that, the kinds of agricultural science that we might be capable of doing will contribute to that, but that the center of it will be more culturally based.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you.
So I have to admit to texting during your talk. It's because I found you an office to meet with Wendy.
Oh, good. Thank you. No problem.
You're not sat in the middle of the hall here trying to talk.
Yeah, that's great. Let me get rid of this.